Hey everybody, it's Chris from Chris Beat Cancer, and today my guest is Dr. Colin Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a legend in the health and wellness world. He's been studying nutrition for over 50 years and has authored over 300 research papers. He's also Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University. Dr. Campbell is most famous for the China study, which was the culmination of a 20-year partnership with Cornell, Oxford University, and the Chinese Academy of Preventive Medicine, and is the most comprehensive study of health and nutrition ever conducted. Dr. Campbell is the co-author of the international best-selling book about the China study called The China Study with his son, Thomas Campbell. And he also authored the international bestseller Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition. I've read both of these books. They're both fantastic. I highly recommend them all the time to anyone that's interested in health, nutrition, preventing and healing chronic disease. So it's an incredible honor to be with you, Dr. Campbell. Thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I'd love to start by asking you if you would take us back to your earliest discoveries regarding nutrition and cancer.
Well, my research actually started more than 50 years ago. It's been 63 to be honest about it. On food and health in general, and that was my graduate research studies. And my interest at that time and my doctoral dissertation was focused on the idea that the more protein we consume, the better we're going to be health-wise. And that really meant animal-based protein. So that's the background I came from. In addition, I came from a farm and did that sort of thing, just like a lot of people. But in any case, when I had my first faculty position in 1965. That was at Virginia Tech, Department of Biochemistry. I was asked to be coordinator for a national program in the Philippines, supported by the State Department, a project that was designed to develop a model for feeding malnourished children. And so the idea was, in my community, and I went along with that too, was that the more protein they got, the better off these children would be. Malnourished children generally was due to either inadequate calories or not enough protein. So we took up that responsibility, my senior colleague and I did. And I just happened to have seen something that was totally anecdotal, namely that it appeared that the children who ate the most protein in the Philippines, small number by the way, seemed to have the higher risk for getting liver cancer. Hard to believe, but I saw it. And at the same time, there was an article from India, an experimental animal study at the time, that suggested that high protein intake could turn on cancer. I had just organized a laboratory in Manila to analyze for a chemical carcinogen that causes liver cancer. That combination of experiences, not terribly impressive, but it left me with a question in my mind. On the one hand, we're going there to make sure these children got more protein, good quality protein, so to speak, than being animal-based. And on the other hand, I'm seeing this, really not quite believable. It's not consistent with what I thought I would hear. So that meant I had to answer that question. And I got a grant from NIH to do the research experimentally back home. That grant lasted for the next 27 years. So during that time, I learned a lot of things and came to the realization that high animal protein consumption increases cancer. In fact, it was very strong. It was really incredibly impressive, actually, in the various and sundry ways we did it. It was impressive, too, from the Indian workers who had seen the same thing. So it was at that point in time I had a chance to go to China. Now we're talking about the 1980s. To go to China to have a look there, to see whether or not in a human population, not experimental animal, but to see in this human population whether high animal protein consumption might be related to cancer. In China, they had just completed a massive survey of some 2,500 counties. showing the cancer rates for these different counties. And so with my colleague from China and myself and another colleague from Oxford University, we organized a study in China to survey as best we could, the various things people do, to see why cancer was so common in some counties and not in others. Difference in these different counties. So we did a dietary survey. We actually measured what they consumed. We had access to a lot of data on disease rates. We collected blood samples and urine samples and so forth. All with the effort to see whether or not diet had any effect on these different cancer rates in China. I was particularly interested in knowing whether or not the consumption of animal protein might be related because of my work back in the laboratory. So the China study served two purposes in a sense. I was able to see whether or not what we were looking at in the laboratory might be confirmed in humans. And secondly, there could not have been a better opportunity in a case like this, because the rates of cancer for about a dozen different cancers were very different for different parts of the country. So we collected this massive amount of information to see what we could find. And sure enough, after getting that information and starting to look at it early 1990s, it essentially confirmed what I was seeing in the laboratory. So it was a combination of laboratory experiments together with what we saw in China, together with two other information from other laboratories. They convinced me that the higher the consumption of animal protein, obviously in the form of animal food, the higher rates for cancer. And it was quite remarkable. It turns out the kind of diet increases cancer, in this case animal protein-based diets. That same kind of diet is what also increases heart disease and diabetes and a few other things. So I felt like I was onto a really big opportunity here concerning nutrition that had such a remarkable effect, not only in terms of the size of the effect, but also in terms of its breadth of effect, meaning, a variety of different diseases. All with information is all drawn from the consumption of whole foods, plant-based diet. That was key.
And I think it's worth mentioning that you grew up on an animal farm, right?
I grew up milking cows on a dairy farm.
On a dairy farm. So you didn't come into this research thinking that everyone should eat a plant-based diet or be a vegan or whatever, right?
Absolutely not. I didn't even know the word vegan, vegetarian at the time I came to graduate work.
And
that's right, nothing to do with it.
How long did it take for you to make the own personal decision to change your diet? How many years of this research and these clues did it take to convince you?
Well, keep in mind, I started the formal part of the research in 1969. Okay, in 1978, what is that, 10 years later or so, I started to see some changes. I started to see some evidence in our laboratory animal studies that were very suggestive.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, when we, for example, fed animals 20% protein as a percent of calories, and the protein we were feeding, by the way, was milk protein. When we started feeding that at this higher level of 20% of calories, that's when the cancers really grew. Cancers that were initiated by a chemical carcinogen, the one that I was trying to, in the Philippines, to identify how much was being consumed, basically.
And what's the name of that carcinogen?
Aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is a compound produced by a mold. It was then, and I think it still is today, the most potent chemical carcinogen ever discovered.
Is aflatoxin a concern for people in westernized countries like the U.S.?
No, I say no. And the reason I said, I followed that question for many, many years. Basically, aflatoxin tends to occur in peanuts and corn. And it did at the time, then during the 1960s and 1970s, it was a great concern to the peanut industry, if you will. But what was worked out is that it's only an occasional kernel peanut kernel that is contaminated, and it can be contaminated, at a very high level. But this kind of thing that we're eating peanuts out of a shell, we see something like that, we don't eat it. And so it's just of no consequence, essentially. When we eat peanuts produced commercially, or peanut butter, for example, the FDA actually has done a fairly good job in monitoring that. So whatever exposure we get is very, very tiny, number one. Number two, we humans tend to be resistant to that carcinogen anyhow. So that's the reason for my answer is it's not a consequence. What is of consequence is the fact that experimentally, when we're exposing the carcinogen, for example, or giving a carcinogen, which it caused 100%, for example, cancer response in experimental animals. On the other hand, it was the protein that controlled whether or not that occurred. And that's a big deal, I have to say, because it sort of goes to the popular notion that cancer is a genetic disease, in the sense that the carcinogen is attacking the DNA, the stuff of genes. That's what starts it. And we tend to assume these carcinogens are what causes cancer. In reality, what we were learning, it's not the gene that may start the business. It's the amount of protein in this case, or nutrition in general, that controls whether or not cancer occurs. That's, again, kind of a big idea. I'm still working on it these days. Yes, and all of this sort of translates into, we looked at this question quite thoroughly, actually, it translates into consuming animal-based foods. That's where the animal protein comes from. Plant proteins don't do this. Only the protein in animal food. So there you have it. And then the question becomes even more significant when you think about what else is in animal foods, what is missing from plant foods when we eat animal, so forth and so on. And so it's become, for me, these years, many years later, it's a very big issue. And what I am saying is something I would never have said growing up this way. I would never have said, don't eat animal foods. Or I would never have believed that animal foods were a problem. But I am at that point.
So it took you about 10 years to change your own diet, or longer?
Well, 10 years we started to change our diet a little bit. What that meant, to be specific, is my wife was very good about this. She also was changing our food, of course. But what we started to do was to eat more salad. That meant chicken salad and tuna salad. Not terribly helpful, to be honest about it. But then in the next 2 or 3 years, as the research became a little more convincing, let's say in the early 1980s, we dropped the meat. But we kept using, then we started using chicken. Still also consuming plenty of dairy too, because that's where I came from. And it goes on to the middle 80s, late 80s. By the time the late 80s rolled around, I said, that's it. So we basically changed almost completely. And certainly by the early 1990s, it was 100%. So it was, I have to say that I want to emphasize this was entirely because of the scientific evidence. This was not an ideological concern. Eventually I began to appreciate that argument, obviously, and it's a very important argument. But my decision rested entirely on the research we were doing, which, incidentally, the research we were doing was, I published it extensively, in major journals. It was research that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And throughout my entire career, the money we got to do the research, and I had a big program, the money we got came entirely from taxpayer-funded research. 100%, every last cent. So I'm not associated with any particular commercial interest in making this story.
It wasn't funded by the broccoli lobby?
No, I think not. I'm not even aware they even have a lobby, but in any case, no, none of that. I like science. You probably can tell, and I really had a lot of fun working in that area, and I had a lot of students, a lot of graduate students as well. I had the biggest research program in our department at Cornell University, for example, which was at that time ranked as #1 in the country. So I was living in heaven as far as this research is concerned. A lot of students, I love working with students, doing a lot of research, publishing stuff, giving lectures, so forth and so on, and then getting involved in national policy development, especially in Washington. I mean, the whole package was a lot of excitement.
Were you able to identify any animal proteins specifically that were more antagonizers? Like, for example, casein in dairy or fish, red meat, eggs. Was there a spectrum in your mind, or based on your research, I should say, that you felt some were more risky to consume than others?
Well, as far as the animal proteins are concerned, it's a lot of work just to work with one. And that was the one that was available. Okay? We did look at a couple of plant proteins. They did not do that, even when the plant proteins were at the level of 20%.
And you were working with casein primarily, right?
Yeah, casein, exactly.
And which plant proteins did you also?
Well, there are many other animal proteins, as you know. I had a friend, a rather famous friend scientist in Canada, who was also using proteins of different kinds to study its relationship to heart disease. And he took a bunch of different animal proteins, compared to a bunch of different plant proteins, and showed that all the animal proteins, in his case, increased blood cholesterol and increased the risk of heart disease. And they're all above the plant proteins. In other words, the animal proteins just acted more or less like a group. There were some differences, yes, but basically they're more or less acting like each other compared to plant proteins. Plant proteins did not do that. That's also consistent with another thought that was part of my own research way back in graduate school. We had a concept called biological value. Biological value is basically the efficiency with which proteins are used for growth, maybe. And it turns out under those circumstances, all animal proteins tend to act like each other. All plant proteins tend to also like each other and are different. So we're seeing the same phenomenon across the board. So to answer your question, I did not use other animal proteins. I could not do that. That would cost way more time and money that I had available, to say nothing of even finding sources of that material, or isolated sources. So I'd rely on that idea that I just told you about, but for two things: blood cholesterol levels, as well as biologic value. We see animal proteins being one group, turning on things. Plant proteins are doing something different. And I am absolutely and then we did, plant protein, animal protein here too. And so I think you can just generally accept, not just on the basis of what I just said, but additional considerations. Animal proteins are animal food, basically, better said, is a problem. Much more than I was prepared to say early in my career. It's obviously a very provocative idea. I know that. And I have felt that probably, that the pushback in that case. But now it's this whole question concerning, our health status and the cost of health care and all that sort of thing are important questions.
Were there any specific findings from the China study that stood out to you? What more did you learn as a result of the China study?
Well, one thing I think that's a good question, because I was thinking about some of this question prior to that. But in China, what we learned was that Western diseases in general, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and so forth, they tended to aggregate together in certain geographic areas, namely in and around cities. In contrast to so-called diseases of poverty, like tuberculosis and those kind of infectious diseases, they tended to be more in the rural areas where there's more poverty. So we saw this big split between animal-based foods and those kind of, between the so-called Western diseases and others. That was not an original observation, by the way, I have to emphasize. Many others had seen the same thing when comparing countries and so forth. So that was one thing that kind of stood out. we got these Western chronic degenerative diseases, we like to say, heart disease, cancer, so forth and so on. They tend to occur in similar geographic regions. Then we could ask the question, establishing this fact, statistically speaking, by the way, establishing this distribution of diseases in different areas, we then could ask the question, what is the chief causes of these Western diseases? We measured lots of things. We had access to a lot of data, blood data especially. And it turned out the most significant factor related to Western disease in China, which were much lower, by the way, than what we have here. But nonetheless, the factor that stood out most was the blood cholesterol levels. Even then, the blood cholesterol levels in China were very low by our standards. In rural China, where most of our study was.
How low? What was the range?
Well, the range was from, these are means for different counties, so it makes it even more impressive. The range of the means, the county means, went from 88 milligrams per deciliter to 170. Their high was near our low. Their average was 127.
Wow.
127. That's an average of means across different counties. Really quite substantial data. And we analyzed those. At the first when I saw that, I thought, this can't be true. We've done something wrong here. So I went back and actually, with the laboratories I was working with at the time, of which there were quite a number, we went back and analyzed those samples again with a different method, different laboratories, got the same results. So it was 127. In this country, there was evidence at that time that if you went below 140, 150, there was a higher rate of suicides. It was really something really crazy, or maybe a higher rate of colon cancer. There was some evidence to suggest that was nonsense, of course. So I shared this information with my colleagues in heart disease, obviously. They were surprised to see this too. But then all of a sudden they started coming together. Then all of a sudden other people are starting to talk about the idea, hey, we can have cholesterol levels as low as, let's say, 100 or 110, 120. And when people eat this kind of diet, that's what they get, for the most part, really low levels. That was another observation. You asked for a big observation. That was one for me. And the other one was comparing the different counties, one with another, and some counties being so high in some cancers and so low in other cancers. I mean, I'm talking about several dozen-fold differences, or maybe even a few hundred-fold differences between highest and lowest. That was a big observation because that really showed that cancer is so localized geographically. And whatever is causing the cancer is, also distributed geographically. In this country, if we saw, let's say, a 2 or 3-fold range from one part of the country to another, that's the most we're going to see. But in popular discussions in this country, in professional discussion in this country, if we see a change in cancer rates from 10% or 20% or 30%, we make big news out of it. That's nothing. It's insignificant. That's nothing compared to what we were seeing in China. That was a big, a bit of awareness at the same time that we're talking about something here that is really big. Cancer almost, in a sense, you could sort of argue, I guess, cancer almost is non-existent if the conditions are absolutely right. Where obviously if conditions are wrong, we're going to get a lot of cancer.
Were there any clues when you were looking at these different counties that had such a high discrepancy in cancer rates?
Well, the best clues we had, as I said, was serum cholesterol, but that in turn related to what goes along with consuming diets high in cholesterol, namely animal foods, but cholesterol only occurs in animal foods. And by the same token, when we consume more animal foods, more cholesterol, we're consuming less plant foods because our total consumption is kind of like a zero-sum game. We consume more of one, we consume less of the other. That's a big deal too, because when we see correlations between animal-based protein, for example, in various diseases, as we see across different countries, we could say, oh, that's due to animal protein. Let's say we could say that. But in reality, what that's representing is not only the animal protein and the things that go along with it, like saturated fat and so forth. It's not only that, but it's also decreased the consumption of plant foods. That makes this whole story really pronounced, because then we don't. In some ways, people like this, especially policy, we don't need to go after, or we don't need to be so assertive about not consuming animal foods. Might be the better sort of approach is to say, eat plant food, stop there. Make sure the whole food plant-based. And people get the message. But either way, it's the same message.
That really is my message. It's encouraging people to eat tons of fruits and vegetables. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables, whole foods. And the more fruits and vegetables you eat, the less room in your diet there is for junk food, animal food, processed food, all of those things.
It's a good message. Good way.
Were you friends with Dennis Burkitt?
Yes, I was.
Would you talk about him?
Yes, I had dinner with him. I think it was about 3 times, and we really kind of hit it off. He was in his later years at that time, but then he was given an award for lifetime achievement by the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Rather well known. It's almost next to the Nobel Prize. But in any case, he was given that award, and he asked me at the conference that was held to come down and give the keynote for his presentation. It was an honor for me, and I have been a fan of Dennis Burkitt, obviously, for a long time. He's a wonderful man. He did his work in Africa, as you might know, and he was focused on fiber. He was discovering, for example, that the higher the fiber consumption, the lower the rate of colon cancer to be won, and so he was a forerunner for this kind of thing.
He is. I am a fan of Dr. Burkitt, for sure. As a colon cancer survivor, and as much research as I've done on that disease, especially, it was in some ways it was exciting to discover his research, but also frustrating. And I think the two of you probably obviously have a lot in common here. But when you're publishing research that has such significant implications toward health and disease and prevention, and yet the medical industry pays no attention to it. Federal guidelines aren't changed. In fact, you were talking about cholesterol. Well, now you're considered normal or healthy if your cholesterol is 200.
Yeah, I mean, the general comment is similar to what you had just said before. Let's get our cholesterol down as low as we can. Now, the baseline cholesterol level for different people is somewhat different, as you are, I'm sure, not surprised. But there's a few individuals who can't quite get it. They can get it down to maybe 180, 190. I even know a couple of people who say they can't get it below 200, who are eating the right thing, so they say. I'm actually one of those people, so I tend to pay attention. My bottom cholesterol level is more or less like between 160 and 180. I can't get it down to what the Chinese do. And I mention that as significant because we are different. Therefore, the question arises, do we have some differences? My mother had cholesterol levels 330, 340, if you can believe it. So I'm down to 170, 180 and something like that, and quite happy with it, to be honest. I can't get it much lower. But I actually ran across an idea there too and did some research on it. It was published in Science. It published in good places and it stimulated quite a lot of research. Namely, it's this. I won't get into all the details, but it turns out whether or not we're nursed as we're infants makes a difference.
Really?
Yes. If for people who are who for whatever reason are not nursed, they seem to have a higher baseline cholesterol level. This is not always true, but there certainly is that evidence there. I was not nursed, by the way. And what all that relates to is the fact that when infants are born, the best thing they can do is to be breastfed. They're going to be exposed to human milk. Human milk has cholesterol in it. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. So it turns out when at that very young age, when babies are being exposed to this cholesterol level typical of human milk, for example, they tend to actually establish systems that accommodate, then they can handle cholesterol. People who are not nursed don't get exposure to cholesterol at that time. Therefore, their bodies are not prepared to handle it when it's being overconsumed later in life.
So there's some kind of programming that's happening very early in life with the cholesterol in mother's milk, hypothetically speaking.
I have a name for that. It's called imprinting.
Got it.
That's really what it was. It's an early imprint. We did some research on that. In this case, in experimental animals, but it was derived from some results that I knew of in baby boys, watching them develop cholesterol over time. And it really, I mean, I think it still is a very good idea. Others have kind of done that.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that. That's not in your books, I don't think.
No, I didn't put it in the book. You just asked the question. I mean, so we have little differences. Come back to the 200 level. I mean, for some people, it might be close to the norm.
Got it.
But the vast majority of people really have been nursed, I think. And they get their cholesterol levels down to, let's say, 150, 140, 130. Some get it down as low as 100.
Mine's fluctuated between about 117 and 150. It's just different for whatever reason, But I'm pretty happy with where it is.
Sure. There's further details on that, too, about, I'm sure there's total cholesterol, and then there's HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, and LDL, the bad, and then the ratio between the two. That's a finer tuning of the whole question, but yeah.
In the book Whole, you talked about the difference between taking vitamin C supplement and eating an apple. And would you expound on that?
Yeah, okay, let me just say the facts first. In that example you just cited, or I had in the book, there's a friend of mine that did this, a colleague who did this, so I'm talking about his research, not mine in this case. But in any case, when you have 100 grams of, let's say, apple, take a sample, 100 grams of apple, and you determine how much vitamin C is in it, you get a number. 5.9 milligrams is essentially. So, and that has a certain amount of activity, biological activity. You test that 100 grams of apple and it gives you a certain biological activity.
So you could extract that much vitamin C from that much apple?
Not quite. You're getting ahead of here. I'm talking about if you just test the whole 100 grams of apple in your test system, you're going to get the equivalent of 5.9 milligrams of vitamin C.
Okay.
Now you want to get I said equivalent. Here's the important part. If you then take 5.9 milligrams, for example, just put it in a test tube or whatever and then test it, it turns out the vitamin C in the apple is about 1,500 times more active than it is standing alone. Big deal. Now, some of that difference, or maybe a lot of that difference, is really related to the fact that in the apple, there's more than just vitamin C. There's other compounds that act like vitamin C. So some of that difference. But still, the difference between the vitamin C in the apple, the same amount in the apple, as opposed to putting in a pill, is huge. Really a huge difference. That in turn corresponds to a lot of other research with other vitamins to show that the vitamins that we take in pill form are not acting in the same way as they do in the food. So there's a big, big difference between the biological activity of food containing the nutrients compared to nutrients being put in pills. And that's that part of the story I was quite involved in myself at a policy level in Washington. Basically, the vitamin industry has relied on false claims for the most part, exaggerated claims at a minimum. And that's been going on for a long time. And it tends to lead, when they make that kind of pitch, that kind of claim, they're leading people to believe, oh, you don't need to eat all that fruits and vegetables, you probably don't like it anyhow, just take these pills. That's the sort of the outcome of that sort of story. That's false. Bad information.
Yeah, that's been the pitch from the vitamin supplement industry. I probably since day one, which is, well, we know you're probably not eating the healthiest diet, but if you take our vitamins, it'll make up for it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm here. Yes, that pitch, I've heard it more times than I can count, and yeah, it just doesn't fly. And there's something to be said about supplementing with some things that you wouldn't get in your diet, right? That aren't prevalent in the diet, but maybe herbs and things you would normally eat. But yeah, would you make the case against reductionism? Will you talk about that?
Well, this example we just talked about, when we let's say we look at the good effects of, let's say, carrots or spinach or something like that, in terms of health, at least as associated with good health outcomes, and all of a sudden we decided, oh, that's because it's got vitamin C in it, or maybe because it has beta carotene, which is a provitamin A, as you know, and so we then get this impression, oh, that's really what counts, and therefore we use it. We put in a pill, or maybe we turn it into something to use like a drug, perhaps. Whatever. Focus on that one thing out of that whole food doesn't work, number one, quite like it should. Focus on that one thing is called reductionism. It's looking at the parts as opposed to the whole. The whole being the whole food, the nutrients being the parts. And so it turns out that when we put it all together and analyze data that way and study it that way and understand what's going on, the whole, that's the whole food, has an amazing effect in creating health, reversing disease, preventing disease, compared to single things. And I can expand on it a little bit more. We tend to think in our lives, in medical research as well as in the medical practice community, we tend to think of the relationship between a cause and effect. We tend to think of it in a very focused way. Here's the cause, single nutrient, single this, single that, and then it goes into the body and it operates by a single mechanism. That's the general thought, we assume that, to produce a specific response. So another single nutrient, single mechanism, specific outcome. Very, very, everything is just very lined up, very specifically, one thing at a time. That's not the way nature works. But however, this is the basis for the entire drug industry. When you stop and think about it. Because the drug industry is founded on that idea. That if we can just find some chemical, whether it's in plants or whatever, we can make it into a drug. And we'll solve the problem. We'll solve this disease, it will maybe not work over there, whatever. And so my consideration of that question and the work I'm now doing, I'm publishing a new book too. I'm elaborating on this point a lot more. I'm talking about the consequences of that kind of thinking over time. How did that arise? Why did we think that way? It's quite natural. We like to think of magic bullets. We like to think we have definite answers for something. So it's kind of a understood way of thinking and doing research, if you will. But when it becomes the dominant and almost the only way of looking at research, I have a problem. I have a serious problem. And so the drug industry, for example, the one figure I have is that 85% of all the drugs that are tried are off the market within a matter of a couple of years because they cause too many side effects or because they don't work. It's a sloppy business. It's a very sloppy business.
Wow. And is that 85% of drugs that actually are brought to market are gone within a few years?
The evidence that I'm referring to, yeah. I can't remember exactly the reference for it, but that's basically what it is. And of the drugs that remain and we use, let's pick one, the biggest one of all, statins. There's 4 or 5 versions of it, as you know. Statins are used to, quote unquote, lower the risk for heart disease. It sort of looks like it. It makes sort of sense when they first got together. It did, because statins is a chemical that is used to block an enzyme involved in the synthesis of cholesterol in our bodies. And at that particular point in time, during the 1980s, 1970s, 80s or so, it was generally thought that high cholesterol in our blood caused heart disease. So the natural thing to do, okay, let's block this cholesterol. We make too much cholesterol. And so they came up with this chemical that did block it. They could identify the very specific enzyme that was involved. And they worked it out quite carefully and very sophisticated technology. They worked out that here's a chemical that will block that reaction. It became known as statin, or the statins. Many different versions of it, and it's been used ever since. Sure enough, statins do reduce cholesterol, significantly reduce cholesterol in general for most people. However, it has side effects. Statins have side effects, muscular discomfort and that sort of thing. And in the reality, when you look at the outcome, how does statins relate to reduction in heart disease risk? It's very poor, and some in the field argue there's nothing. At best, it might help a tiny little bit. Maybe the best I've ever heard is decreasing heart disease by 9%. That's the highest estimate that I've seen. But we put up all those side effects. Now that's become maybe an $80 billion industry. And so many people are using this because of all the advertising and all the rest of it, that statins will, reduce your risk for heart disease. In the meanwhile, the drug industry produced the statins. They're not about to tell people, oh, hey, just change your diet and you get a lot better result. Much more spectacular result without the side effects, and live longer and don't spend the money. So the easy way to do this whole thing is what's not advertised, it's not told, which is a matter of some very significant interest on the part of public health authorities and policies that are made and so forth.
Well, I have to plug Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn at this point. I interviewed him a year or two ago, and of course he's a colleague of yours. I know you're very close, and he's published some wonderful research on reversing heart disease with the plant-based diet.
That's right.
And taking people off of, specifically a low-fat, very low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. Yeah. And, it's just every time I share that interview or refer people to them, to him, everyone wants to argue, right?
That's right.
Everyone wants to argue, but I'm like, look, he did it with people, right? He saved their lives. He prevented future heart attacks and strokes and opened up their arteries, like with nutrition.
That's right. He really did. He is a good friend. We visit a lot, speak on the same platform oftentimes, and we were together in that film called Forks Over Knives, as you probably know. And his most recent study, you may know about that. He sort of advised, I think it was 198 patients over a period of 7 years. You know that study? I mean, we went back to between 2 and 5 years later, something like that, about 3.5 years later, and he got these results that were just, my God, it's just spectacular.
Yeah, the recurrence rate was like 1% or something crazy.
It was one person who actually, was a friend of mine, actually, contact of mine. I sent to Dr. Esselstyn. He had a heart problem, and he unfortunately passed away. That was the one event. But then I did learn later that from someone in his family who said he wasn't quite sticking on the diet like he should, because she came to me and asked me about it.
Yeah.
So, even there, I mean, my gosh, how can you get better results than that?
Yeah, out of almost 200 people, only one person has another cardiac event.
And the ones who did not listen to him, they went back. Of course, they had problems.
They had, I forget the number. It's in our interview. But yeah, the people who didn't follow his advice had a very high rate of further cardiac events. Yeah. Yeah, it's stuff like that. I know it doesn't sell. There's no money in it. And, do you feel like it seems like there certainly is progress being made toward physicians who are prescribing nutrition, whole food, plant-based diets to their patients? I mean, it seems like that is a growing movement since in the last at least 2 or 3 decades since you really started talking about this, I imagine. Are you hopeful that we're headed in the right direction, that things are getting better?
Well, yeah, I would answer the last question first. Yes, it is hopeful. There's no question about that in my mind. I've spoken to at least 200 medical schools and medical conferences, probably 900 altogether. But a lot of physicians only kind of presentations. And at first, when I was doing that, I usually was greeted with silence, and I thought I had messed up. I mean, no questions much and that sort of thing. But now, over time, in the last 4 or 5 years, all of a sudden I've discovered there's an increase in number of physicians that are really keenly interested. In fact, they're really quite annoyed. That's one reaction I got. They're annoyed. What happened? Why haven't we been told this before? Good question. And it raises another point, and that is that there's not a single medical school in the country that actually teaches nutrition. Not one. And then at the same time, let's say physicians come out, they don't know anything about this nutrition thing. Let's say some of them choose to learn about it, and they start maybe doing something with it. At that particular point in time, physicians, we don't have a medical category called nutrition, or medical specialty, I'd say. There's like 130 medical specialties which tend to trigger compensation, reimbursement. Not one's called nutrition, not one. So, doctors aren't able to get the compensation they deserve for even offering this information. I mean, it's a horrendous, major sort of fact.
That is horrendous. I didn't even realize that nutrition wasn't listed as a medical specialty. I knew they didn't really teach it in med school, but I know that insurers, don't really cover it, and so it's difficult for a medical doctor to make a good living when their focus is nutrition versus
That's right.
prescription drugs and surgical procedures and things.
It's a really big societal problem now because it translates into, our physicians are the ones who should first know this information first and foremost. If all of a sudden, you're pulling away from them their chief source of income, that's difficult. And I don't have any quick answer to that. I don't think anyone really does. But on the other hand, I think I have a lot of hope for society in general to do the right thing. And what is happening now I'm going to speak from my activity in the policy arena. It's my experience, has been my experience, that first off, government policy in the form of dietary guidelines and that sort of thing, it comes from the government. Therefore, we tend to regard it as pretty significant, let's say. But that kind of information is tailored in such a way that it does not offend the industry. I've sit at those tables, I've seen that, I say what I'm saying, I mean what I say, and I'm saying what I mean. That the policies that are devised by the government come up with this, ribbons around this information, if you will, revised every 5 years in the case of dietary guidelines. That information is heavily influenced by industry. So the public is not getting information they deserve to have. It's that simple.
And by industry, you're referring to the meat and dairy industries and things.
Well, that and the pharmaceutical industry as well.
Yeah.
I mean, because if I want to be really shorthanded and really cryptic about the whole thing, our taxes are being used to support the growing of food that makes us sick. And then in turn, as customers or as patients, we're there around then to buy the so-called cure for that sickness. So we're feeding the industry the money for them to produce their own food, and in turn they're spending more money, that's through our taxes, spending more money to buy the drugs and so forth to make us well.
And most of those drugs don't make us well, though. That's the problem. But they do make a lot of money for the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, that's why I call the healthcare system the disease care system. That's what we're making money on. We got to have a lot of disease to make this work. I'm not the first that said that, by the way, disease care system. There have been a lot of colleagues have said that. So it's a very difficult proposition to realize that. And the new book I'm now writing is exactly on that topic. how did all this start, and what were the consequences of it, and how might we look around to change things. My best advice for this whole thing is simply inform people, inform the public. They've got to get to know this. And then I forgot to tell you one of the significant things of the last thing I said. So government comes out with these policies. Then they actually proactively will organize efforts to dispute things like I talk about. So the government is proactively basically deflating this kind of information in various forms. That in turn leads to, well, who's the government? The government, as my friend Howard Lyman first said, government is the best, we have the best government that money can buy. We had that Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court 2010, where now any amount of money can be spent to elect certain individuals. And so it's really true. We tend to elect people, with our money. That's really what it is. And those people who have that money, in turn, they don't want to destroy the system of where from they got their money. So the politicians go into Washington, and I mean, a lot of good politicians, I know that, and they don't necessarily want to admit quite this thing. But in reality, they're sitting there, they know where the money came from, they got them elected. They're not going to come out and sort of support guidelines and stuff like this that goes against their supporters.
You're right on the money there. I mean, big money gets politicians elected, and even if they have good intentions, they want to keep the money coming in to the campaign coffers for the next election cycle. So right. They don't want to piss off, the beef industry, right, or the various drug companies that supported their campaign, or the big food companies, Kraft or whoever. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess.
And so the only solution, in my view, maybe there's some others, but it's actually just getting public knowledge, taking control of the whole business of public knowledge, educating, doing things like what you're doing right now, publicizing, just so more people get to know this, because they'll eventually. That's the one thing. Obviously, that will drive. It'll decrease the business to some extent. People will begin to accommodate with all of that. But there's one more thing about what, I don't know, you might intended to bring this up, but I think the biggest problem we now have in our society in this larger context is the effect of food, wrong food, that we eat, the effect it has on the environment. The environment issue is a big, big deal.
Talk about it.
I just came back from a small conference where my oldest son is involved in doing some things along these lines right now with a nonprofit, and quite exciting. But in any case, it turns out that we now have really good evidence that the climate change we're now seeing, the environmental prices we're paying, is man-made. I know there are the deniers and that sort of thing, but I think it's really convincing that the environmental issues we now face that are right in front of us are man-made. And in that sense, the one factor more than any other to cause global warming is our choice to eat livestock. Livestock rearing, livestock or meat consumption is the number one cause of climate change in all of its various forms.
Specific from carbon emissions is the big one, right?
Well, even carbon emissions that result from the transportation and other mechanization that we have to use to raise the livestock. I mean, there's some of that too. In the production of the crop, there's a lot of carbon emissions from that kind of thing. You're referring, of course, to methane and nitrous oxide that animals themselves actually produce. It's kind of complicated because we're now seeing methane come from fracking and other sorts of things like that too. So I don't know exactly what the proportion is, and I'm sure it varies from time to time. But when you add it all up, there's no question about it. The food we consume is the major problem that leads to climate change and other environmental degradation problems. And then we all got to face that, because whatever we may be talking about personal health or that sort of thing, forget it. It doesn't mean anything. We're going to lose our lives. We're going to lose the climate over this. And it is happening very fast. It's one more huge reason why getting information out there about the right food to eat. It's really a huge, I spoke, I was part of the, early on, I was asked to come to the World Bank by the senior advisor to the president of the World Bank on a loan, this about maybe 20 years ago now or so, to come and talk about what I was learning in the area of food. And that gentleman, a guy from South Africa, who was the senior guy, he was quite interested in the environment at that time, because the role of the environmental people at the World Bank was to advise the bank on the loans they make to countries to do this and that, and they were doing the environmental assessment kind of thing. And he had concluded, or had the impression at that time, that livestock farming was an issue. So he had me come and speak, and I did. Got some other people to come and speak too. And it all started to work out pretty well at first. They actually blocked a loan with our input on one occasion, but then somebody came from behind the scenes and got that loan activated anyhow. So it's a big issue. I've been involved in this story for some time, and I gave a lecture at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. That's the UN, FAO offices. That was broadcast. It was streamed to about 100 and some UN offices around the world. I was supposed to stay up there, but then one day later, they pulled it off because the communications offices back in New York had said we don't need to have this kind of information, out there. But since that time, I mean, that was disappointing. But since that time, there are others now really taking up the charge. There's films like Cowspiracy, as you probably know, and others, and now have really started to speak out. And I just, as I say, came from a conference where the people in the environmental movement are gradually coming to terms. It's not just about all the things they think about, it's about the food we eat. So we're working on that question at the moment. We have a nonprofit ourselves that works with Cornell. We're partnering with them in this. We have a new course now coming out, a certificate course on food and the environment. I'm going to argue it's the best in the country. We got a lot of people speaking in this lecture, in these series of lectures, a series of 18 lectures. 2 or 3 courses, people get a certificate for it and so forth. They get professional credit for taking it. And so we really are interested in pushing that initiative.
And you've created multiple courses that people can take online through Cornell on nutrition, correct?
Yeah, well, we have a 1 certificate program, 3 courses at the moment, different titles. That was based on a class that I taught on campus back in the 1990s. It was quite popular with the students, and eventually we put it online. So we're going to be doing some others. I've got a really good crew, lecturers and other people, assistants in doing this. The new course, actually, the content was created by my grandson. Young people are very excited about this, and he was a graduate of the University of North Carolina, and got a really good education. He's really smart as a tack, and has gathered a lot of information together. And he and some others at our center now are going to be bringing that online sometime very soon.
Well, Dr. Campbell, this is really fun. I'd like to ask you one more question. Just a couple more. These are quick ones, quick answer questions. One is, how old are you?
85. You should say, how young am I?
I will amend that.
Oh, yeah, I'm 85. I don't take any drugs.
Right. That's excellent.
And my wife is 78. She doesn't either. She had melanoma earlier years. Stage 3, advanced melanoma. This was way back when the China study first came out, and that's quite a story in itself that you may have read about in whole. And she refused to do the chemo. She refused to do the operation on that part of on her leg where that was. It was in her lymph glands. They wanted to take out her lymph glands. She didn't do any of that. And here it is now, 15 years later, see, no problems.
I love it. And I hear stories like this all the time. I share them all the time, too, of people who've healed with nutrition. The body can heal.
You said something that is really, really important. We talk in the past, through the decades, we've talked about, okay, eat your vegetables, do this and that. It can prevent some disease in the future. We've sort of heard that for a long time. But not a lot of people were convinced that was a good enough reason, because they figured if they got older, they'd find some way to cure it. I did. I thought that myself in the very beginning when I was a kid. But in reality, now the information we have is being done in many different ways. We can actually use this information to reverse, that is, treat disease. So it's time we start talking about using the word treatment, not just prevention. Because now we're talking about the heart of the medical system. We're using food to treat. Very exciting proposition.
It is. I mean, that's my whole mission is really educating people. I mean, we're on the same mission, obviously, but trying to go direct to the consumer with information that they can use to help themselves, because we can't really trust the government to do it because they're owned. And, the truth, unfortunately, is not profitable. So it's not going to pass the official filters of government policy. So we just got to, it's grassroots, ground up. I just want to reach cancer patients and anybody who's serious about health and healing and prevention, and just encourage them, inspire them directly, and let them take that and make decisions that can help themselves.
That's right.
Okay, so last question is, how long have you been eating a whole food plant-based diet?
Let's say 1990.
Got it.
That's a good date.
Yeah, so approaching 30 years.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's just a testament to anyone who thinks, oh, I have to have meat, I have to have animal protein, I'm not going to feel good, or I'm not going to, whatever. I mean, you started when you were roughly 55?
Yes. I started when I was around 45, but then it took 10 years to get to the final stage.
To really commit.
Right.
I might add, another little wrinkle if you're talking to people about this. We have now a family of 22. And my wife has really been, she's the one who's engineered our eating all these years. We have 5 grown children and 11 grandchildren and spouses, 22 of us. We all do this. If that's convincing enough for some people, we don't really have any backsliders. We had a grandson backslide a little bit earlier, but anyhow, we're all eating this way.
That's awesome. Okay, last question is, what's your ideal diet? So what do you like to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And I know it varies every day, but let's just say you're only able to eat the same thing every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They can be different meals, but what would they be?
Well, first off, I'd eat what my wife fixed for me.
Yeah. What would that be?
So she's the one who makes the decisions pretty much. But breakfast, I almost always have fruit and cereal. Cooked cereal, cold cereal, whatever.
Like oatmeal?
Yeah, especially a lot of oatmeal. And lunch is salads. Maybe some hot food, along with it, but always vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, obviously beans, and so forth. And then in the evening, more of the same, but maybe a little more extensive. We've got, the cookbooks didn't used to be out there, but our daughter has a cookbook called the China Study Cookbook. It's now got 175 references. That's really done really well. Our daughter-in-law has also an outstanding book. It's called Plant Pure Nation Cookbook. That's Kim Campbell. And her husband is our oldest son, who's in that climate thing as well. And he's now working with a kind of a pilot thing. He's the one who organized the whole 500. Now we have about 500 wellness groups around the country and outside of the country. They're called pods. That's very exciting. He's got something now, a special effort, actually focused in New York City. I can't tell too many details about it, but it's an opportunity to really expand this message, through a public network. And of course, I think you you might be interested in, how it works. And the son who did the book with me, Tom, he's now a physician. He's a medical director of a program at the University of Rochester Medical Center. And we're actually taking the funding. I want to tell this too because it justifies. I don't take any money from our own nonprofit, by the way. I get no salary. But we've made some pretty good money in that. And we use it in part to support research that he's doing at University of Rochester. And he's doing the kind of research that I never got to. And that is testing the effect of whole food, plant-based nutrition, if you will, on people with disease, as a means of treatment. And the first study has are women with advanced breast cancer. It's already organized. It's organized. We're excited about seeing what's going to happen. It's kind of a pilot study in a sense, the way it's designed, but nonetheless, we'll see something. Now he's got another study having to do with chronic kidney disease. Most of the research, and that's my business, research that we've done over the years in my community tend to be focused on one thing at a time. They haven't seen fit to really do a kind of trial, in an intervention sense, do a kind of trial that will test this amazing, whole food plant-based diet.
I'm really excited about that. That's something that as you know, Dr. Dean Ornish did it with prostate cancer, early stage, and he did it with heart disease. But there really hasn't been, and there needs to be, many interventional studies with nutrition and cancer. And so that's great. I'm glad to hear that that's happening because people are always asking me, like, you should do a study. And I'm like, do you know how much money that could cost to do a proper study? I need a benevolent billionaire to come along and underwrite it.
That's right. Yeah, well, that's one of the things we were talking about before, reductionism and holism. The entire medical system has been framed within a reductionist framework. And so doing something like that, whole food, that's outside of that framework. And so that's not science, as some of my colleagues would say. I know this very well because I was on committees in Washington determining who gets money and who doesn't for NIH and other organizations. And so when we see somebody come in with an application like that in years past, then we had a couple of words for it. It was called a shotgun experiment or fishing expedition. Those are the two words. That's not science. That doesn't count. Because you see, it's not within the reduction framework.
It's not we're not studying one molecule.
That's right. And so that's another area that's a big idea that is worth considering. I'll put all that in the book. I'm doing it now.
Does the new book have a title?
I only have two suggestive titles. I'll just tell the suggestive titles because it sort of explains. One of them is Behind the Curtain, because I was behind the curtain for many years working in policy. And the other is called Nutrition Injustice for All.
I like them both.
So whatever, I'm not sure yet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Campbell. This has been such a pleasure, an absolute honor and a thrill to talk with you. You've made a monumental impact in the health and wellness world and in my life, and I know many of my audience, listeners, fans know your work and will be excited to watch this, and then some of them also maybe don't know you yet, so I'm excited for them to get to know you. So thanks again for your time. Where can people find you?
I'm going to ask that they go through our center. That's what's called Center for Nutrition Studies, where we have the online program. People can take that course. And that is, the address for that is Nutrition Studies, plural, Nutrition Studies, one word, .org. nutritionstudies.org.
Got it. Okay, well, I'll put the links in the show notes below this video. Please share this. People you know and love need to know that nutrition is powerful. It can prevent and reverse disease. And this is not quackery. It's not theory. It's backed by science. And things are changing. So thanks, Dr. Campbell. Bye, everybody.